3 Jeep engines, 200,000 miles, one clear winner. The EcoDiesel, 2.0 Turbo, and 3.6 Pentastar all have loyal fans, but after seeing what actually happens at 200,000 miles, one engine stood above the rest. Here's what we found. Starting at number 3 is the 3.0 EcoDiesel, and honestly, this one is hard to watch. The 3.0-liter EcoDiesel came to the Wrangler and Gladiator lineup in 2020, built by a company called VM Motori in Italy and tuned by Jeep. 260 horsepower, 442 pound-feet of torque, which is more pulling power than anything else Jeep has ever put in a regular buyer's vehicle. Up to 29 miles per gallon on the highway. It won Ward's 10 best engines 3 years in a row. On paper, it's the best engine Jeep has ever made for long trips or towing heavy stuff. The range, the fuel economy, the low-end grunt, nothing in the lineup touches it. But at 200,000 miles, the EcoDiesel doesn't just show up with normal wear, it shows up with a bill. What most buyers never see on the spec sheet is that this engine carries the most complicated emissions setup of anything Jeep has ever sold in America. A diesel particulate filter that traps soot, a system that sprays fluid into the exhaust to cut emissions, a recirculation cooler that takes hot exhaust gas, cools it with engine coolant, and sends it back into the intake. And every single one of those systems has its own way of failing. When one breaks, it puts stress on the others. The engine that looks best on paper is the same one that asks the most of you, and that part doesn't show up in the brochure. The EGR cooler is where most EcoDiesel stories start going wrong. That recirculation cooler works by passing extremely hot exhaust gases right next to engine coolant inside a small metal housing. The temperature difference between those two things is massive, and over time it cracks the housing from the inside. When that crack opens up, coolant leaks into the intake and burns in the engine. From the outside you get white smoke from the exhaust, a temperature gauge climbing, and a check engine light. Fixing it means pulling a lot of the engine apart, and the bill runs between $2,000 and $3,000. First-generation EcoDiesels from 2014 through 2016 were cracking these coolers as early as 20,000 to 40,000 miles. Jeep knew about the problem in 2014. They didn't issue a recall until 2019. A class action lawsuit settled for $307.5 million in May 2019, covering roughly 104,000 vehicles. The 2020 redesign made it better, but it didn't make it go away. At 200,000 miles, EGR wear was right there on our bench. But the EGR cooler isn't the failure that ends careers. That's the CP4 fuel pump, and what it does is unlike anything else on this list. The CP4 is the high-pressure fuel pump in the EcoDiesel. It was designed for European diesel, which is slipperier than the diesel you pump at any American gas station. American diesel doesn't keep it lubricated properly, so over time the pump grinds itself apart from the inside, and when it does, it sends metal shavings straight into the fuel rail, the injectors, and every fuel line connected to the system. You can't just swap the pump. The metal contamination is already everywhere. The entire fuel system has to come out and be replaced. That job runs between $8,000 and $15,000, depending on how far the damage spread before the pump finally quit. Stellantis recalled about 60,000 EcoDiesel vehicles for this, but a lot of failures happened outside the recall window or in trucks that didn't qualify. And it can happen fast, sometimes before 70,000 miles, with almost no warning at all. That's also not the only bill waiting. The filter that catches soot from the exhaust, the DPF, clogs up when the engine doesn't spend enough time at highway speed. Diesel engines need long drives to burn off that soot in a cleaning cycle. Short trips, trail runs, and stop-and-go city driving stop that cycle from ever finishing. When the filter gets too clogged, the engine goes into a low-power mode until you fix it. A full filter replacement runs over $3,000. There's more on top of that. The timing chain tensioner starts wearing from around 60,000 miles and eventually rattles at cold start until it's replaced. Glow plugs fail early on this engine, usually somewhere between 48,000 and 71,000 miles, and replacing the whole set costs between $400 and $800 with labor. The oil cooler, which is a completely separate part from the EGR cooler, can crack and let engine oil mix into the coolant. That one starts at $1,500 to fix and goes up from there depending on how long it ran before anyone noticed. The EcoDiesel at 200,000 miles isn't a wear story like a normal engine. It's a story about surviving a list. Getting here means the CP4 didn't take you out, the EGR held together, the DPF kept regenerating, and you caught the leaks before they turned into something bigger. Some owners have made it to 280,000 miles without a major failure. Others were done before 70,000. The ones who made it to 200,000 are almost always the kind of people who are obsessive about maintenance, and even they usually paid for something major along the way. Before we get to the winner, if you want to avoid the expensive mistakes that kill Jeeps early, check out my 500,000-mile Jeep blueprint. It's packed with maintenance schedules, preventative tips, and money-saving advice. The link is in the description below. Number 2 is the 2.0 Turbo, and the bench told a story nobody on the team saw coming. The 2.0-liter GMET4 is the engine Jeep introduced in 2018 to replace the V6 for buyers who wanted better fuel economy and more low-end grunt without the extra weight. Twin-scroll turbocharger, direct injection, 270 horsepower, 295 pound-feet of torque that kicks in way lower in the rev range than the V6 can manage. It weighs less. It makes more low-end pull. And from the day it came out, Jeep forums gave it maybe 80,000 miles before it grenaded. At 200,000 miles, the bench told a completely different story. The cooling system is where the 2.0 Turbo holds its biggest risk, and it's worth understanding exactly what happens when it goes wrong. The engine runs a second cooling circuit just for the turbocharger, completely separate from the main system, with its own electric pump, its own plastic tank, and its own set of hoses. That plastic tank sits right next to the turbo, and over time the heat breaks it down. The hose between the lower radiator and the water pump has leaked enough times that Jeep put out a formal service bulletin on it. And the thing that makes this really dangerous is simple. That secondary coolant tank is solid black. You cannot see through it. You cannot tell at a glance how much coolant is in there. So owners lose coolant and don't know it's happening until the engine overheats. 2 cylinders lose pressure, and what started as a leaking hose that cost almost nothing ends with a tow truck and an engine rebuild. The people whose 2.0 turbos made it to 200,000 all had the same routine. They checked their coolant on a schedule because they knew that tank was solid and you can't trust what you can't see. They changed their oil with full synthetic every 5,000 miles or less. They ran 91 octane fuel, which this engine actually needs to manage boost and timing properly when it's working hard. The 2.0 doesn't give you much slack the way a naturally aspirated engine does. Skip oil changes or let the coolant slide, and you're not making it here. Direct injection causes carbon buildup on the intake valves, and this engine is no different. Fuel goes straight into the cylinder instead of washing over the valve faces, so oil mist from the crankcase system slowly bakes onto the back of the valves and hardens. At 200,000 miles, the buildup was there, but it was lighter than you'd see on a bigger turbocharged engine running at full power all the time. The 2.0 doesn't have to work as hard as a larger engine to move the same vehicle, so it runs at lower boost most of the time. Less heat per cycle, slower buildup, and that gap adds up over 200,000 miles in a way that actually matters. And then came the result that genuinely shocked everyone in the room. We expected the turbocharger to be the worst thing we'd find under the hood of the 2.0. That was the whole narrative going in. But the twin-scroll design and the water-cooled exhaust housing actually pull a lot of heat away from the turbo bearings, compared to older bolt-on setups, where the turbo just sits on the exhaust and cooks. On the engines where the owner let it idle for a couple of minutes after hard driving before shutting it off, the oil kept flowing long enough to pull heat out of the bearings before everything stopped. The bearing condition on the bench was closer to the PENTASTAR than to anything we expected. That is not a sentence anyone thought they'd be writing going into this test. The variable valve timing system also showed less wear than the other engines here. A smaller engine that doesn't have to push as hard runs its oil cleaner for longer, and clean oil reaching those timing components across 200,000 miles makes a real difference at teardown. The 2.0 turbo is not the ticking bomb the forums called it, but the catch is real. Maintain it on a strict schedule with the right fuel and consistent coolant checks, and it gets here in solid shape. Let any of that slip, and the cooling system doesn't give you a warning before it becomes a major problem. And coming in at number 1 is the 3.6 PENTASTAR, the winner, even though it's hiding something Jeep never fixed. The 3.6 PENTASTAR has been in Jeep since 2011. It's the engine in the Wrangler, the Grand Cherokee, and the Gladiator. No turbo, no boost, just a naturally aspirated V6 with 293 horsepower. By 2020, Stellantis had built over 10 million of them across 17 different models. When someone asks which Jeep engine just runs without drama, this is the one people point at without thinking twice. At 200,000 miles, the PENTASTAR showed us something the spec sheet has never mentioned, and most owners don't learn about until they're already in the middle of it. The oil filter housing lives deep in the valley of the engine, bolted right to the aluminum block. It's made of plastic. And the problem is that plastic and aluminum don't expand and contract at the same rate when the engine heats up and cools down. Do that cycle tens of thousands of times, and the plastic gets brittle, the rubber seals rot out, and oil starts quietly filling the valley of the engine. It can sit there, collecting, sometimes up to a full quart, before a single drop ever hits the ground under your Jeep. Multiple shops say this is the #1 repair they do on any PENTASTAR vehicle. The one on our bench had done exactly what techs across the country have been seeing for years. Dealers have charged as much as $1,330 to fix it. The real fix is swapping the plastic housing for an aluminum one, because aluminum expands the same way as the block it's sitting on. But most owners don't find out about that until they've already been told it's probably the rear main seal, which is a much bigger and more expensive job that isn't even the actual problem. That's the most important thing to know about the PENTASTAR oil leak. Because the oil pools high in the engine and then drips down toward the back near the transmission, most shops see it and immediately say rear main seal. That diagnosis sends people down a rabbit hole that costs far more than the actual fix. The oil filter housing is sitting 30 inches higher up, and you can't get to it without taking the intake manifold off first. Shops that don't know to look there will drop the transmission chasing a seal that's perfectly fine. Getting the right diagnosis and swapping to the aluminum housing costs a fraction of the wrong repair. The second thing we found was the valve train. The PENTASTAR uses roller rocker arms with small needle bearings inside, and those bearings wear down at high mileage. When they do, you get the famous PENTASTAR tick, a tapping sound from the top of the engine that speeds up with the throttle and gets louder over time. Catch it early, and you're just replacing rocker arms, which is manageable. Ignore it long enough, and the worn rocker starts eating the camshaft, and that repair costs 10 times more. The 2011 to 2013 PENTASTARs had this problem badly enough that Chrysler extended the warranty on the left cylinder head to 10 years or 150,000 miles. The 2016 update made the rocker arms stronger, but at 200,000 miles, valve train wear showed up on our bench regardless of which version of the engine it was. What the PENTASTAR doesn't have is the stacking problem. No turbo sitting there soaking up heat after every pull and shortening bearing life. No boost pressure grinding against seals for 200,000 miles. No fuel pump that can blow up and contaminate the entire fuel system in one shot. The list of things wrong with this engine at 200,000 miles was short. Both items had known fixes. Neither one was going to strand you on a mountain pass. The PENTASTAR won because it ages in a straight line. And when you're at 200,000 miles, a straight line beats a lottery ticket every time. So after the teardown, after everything, the numbers don't lie. The EcoDiesel finishes third, and it's not close. The torque is real, the fuel economy is real, and the people who make it to 200,000 miles in one of these are genuinely impressive. But the CP4 fuel pump can cost you $15,000 in a single shot. The EGR cooler is a known weak point from the day the engine ships. The soot filter needs long highway runs to stay alive, and the repair bills tend to land without much warning. The floor for owning this engine long-term is higher than either of the other two engines here, and the ceiling for how bad it gets is higher too. The 2.0 turbo finishes second, and that result surprised everyone on the bench. The turbo bearings held up. The timing components were in better shape than expected. The carbon buildup was lighter than it had any right to be. It earned second place, but it earned it by being maintained exactly right, with the right oil, the right fuel, and a coolant check schedule that most people never bother with. Without that, the cooling system is where this engine dies, and it goes fast. The 3.6 PENTASTAR wins. Not because it's perfect, The plastic oil housing is a real flaw that Stellantis has known about for over a decade and never properly fixed at the factory. The valve train tick is real, and it gets worse the longer you wait. But no turbo, no boost system, no emissions hardware that can destroy the fuel system, and a short, predictable list of things that wear at high mileage. Fewer parts under high stress means a lower bill at 200,000 miles, and that's what this test came down to. That's it for today's comparison. I'd also love to hear from you. Which engine do you trust the most, and why? Leave a comment below. If you found this helpful, subscribe so you don't miss future Jeep tips, buying guides, and long-term ownership advice. And if you want to keep learning, click the video on your screen now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.